Hello, this is Talib Küçükcan. Welcome to TRT World Digital Debates. Today we are going to look at the deal between United Arab Emirates and Israel and its impact on the region and also on Palestinian and Israeli conflict. Today we have got very well experienced, very well known and respected guest, Mr. Marwan Mashir. He was former Deputy Prime Minister of Jordan. Before we move on to our discussion, I just would like to introduce him to our audience very briefly. Marwan Mashir is currently the Vice President for Studies at Carnegie. He looks at research on the Middle Eastern issues in Washington, Beirut, and the Middle East in general. Actually, he began his career as a journalist, but he moved on to diplomacy and politics, ended up in think tank. So he was a journalist in the Jordan Times. Then he served at the Ministry of Planning at the Prime Minister's office as press advisor. In 1991, this is, I think, very relevant to our discussion, he opened Jordan's first embassy in Israel, and in 1996, he became Minister of Information and the government spokesperson. From 1997 to 2002, he served in Washington again as an ambassador. So he has a very good, I think, diplomatic experience as well. So he was Foreign Minister of Jordan between 2002 2004 and Deputy Prime Minister between 2004 and 2015. So he is also, he has a lot of experience in politics as well. Now, I would like to move on to our discussion. Again, Marwan Mashir, welcome to our program. It's a privilege to host you today. On August the 13th, Israel and the United Arab Emirates have signed a historic agreement. And there is a lot of dispute and debate on that, whether this will open a new chapter in Israeli-Arab relations or not. The deal has been painted by US, Israel, and the UAE as a bold step to advance the long-stalled Palestinian-Israeli peace process. From your standpoint, what does the deal mean for Palestinians in the region, and also in general, as far as the Middle Eastern context is concerned?
The deal has been described by the United States and by Israel as a breakthrough for peace. In fact, it is no such thing. It is clear that this is a bilateral deal done between the UAE and Israel for bilateral interests. It frankly has little to do with the peace process. The explanation that all three countries gave is that it resulted in the freeze of annexation that Israel was planning as far as the West Bank is concerned. This does not mean much. Menachem Begin in 1978 also froze settlement building for 3 months, and we know where all that went. So it's important to understand what the deal is not about. This is not about a breakthrough for peace. This is about serving purely UAE Israel's interests.
Right. I think that's a very short but very clear, I think, answer. When Jordan and Egypt signed peace treaties with Israel, they did so primarily for the return of the Sinai Peninsula. In other words, the treaties were penned under the Land for Peace formula, actually. So this was the picture in the past. Given that the UAE has no such concerns, because it has nothing to do with the border, etc., what leverage is the deal likely to have over the Israelis?
As you said correctly, Egypt signed a peace deal with Israel to get the Sinai back. Jordan signed a peace deal with Israel to end the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. Jordan has always been concerned that if there is no two-state solution, if there is no Palestinian state on Palestinian soil in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, then Israel might try to effect a solution at Jordan's expense. Many Israelis called for this Jordan is Palestine argument. So in both these cases, yes, the deal was land for peace. This deal is different in that it calls for no return of land, so it is peace for peace. And it changes the whole paradigm with which the Arab-Israeli conflict has been operating under for the last 30 or 40 years. The Arab Peace Initiative, for example, was a land for peace initiative in return for Israeli withdrawal from all Arab land, including Palestinian land, Lebanese land, and the Golan Heights Syrian land, that Arab states are going to make peace, all of them, with Israel. The UAE deal changes the formula somewhat. The UAE is a small country. It does not. It's not a major political weight in the Arab world. The danger is that if other Arab countries follow through with a deal with Israel that does not include or is not based on the Arab Peace Initiative, then the whole two-state solution and the whole land for peace formula will be undermined and probably, for good.
Well, we will come to this issue, two-state solution issue as well. But how likely is it that some other Arab countries or the Gulf countries will follow the footstep of UAE in recognizing Israel?
It's not clear. A lot of people expect or want, particularly in the US, Saudi Arabia to follow suit. I think that it is very difficult for Saudi Arabia at this stage to sign a similar deal with the Israelis. It's not that the Saudis and the Israelis don't have close relations, particularly on security vis-a-vis Iran. But it's one thing to have these relations, and it's quite another for a country like Saudi Arabia, which claims that it is the protector of the Islamic holy sites, where Jerusalem plays a big part in their political discourse. It is very difficult, I think, for the Saudis, and in particular, while King Salman is still alive, I think it will be very difficult for them to follow suit. There are other Gulf states that have relations with Israel. The Omanis do, the Bahrainis do, and the Qataris do. I don't expect the Qataris to follow suit. Oman and Bahrain remain an open question. But I don't think that we can expect many other Gulf states to follow suit in the near future.
Right. You have a lot of experience in the Arab-Israeli relations in the government and also in the think tank industry, I would say. And you opened the Jordan's first embassy in Israel in 1995, as I said in the beginning. On a popular level, how is the deal being received in Jordan, in your country, and also at the broader Arab region?
The reaction in Jordan is quite negative. The reaction among the Palestinians is quite negative. And in general, I would say the reaction throughout the Arab world is negative at the popular level, not at the official level. I mean, officially, Gulf states have not had a negative reaction to the deal. Why is the reaction negative? We need to understand that it is not that people are not against peace, but it is that by signing such deals, particularly that don't involve an exchange of land for peace, Israel is using the argument that it doesn't need peace with the Palestinians if they are able to sign peace deals with the Arab world or parts of the Arab world. And people tend to forget, particularly in the West, that it is not the UAE nationals or Arab nationals that are living under occupation. It is the Palestinians that are living under occupation. And therefore, if one cannot come to terms with this fact, and if the Israelis cannot understand that no matter how many peace deals they sign with the rest of the Arab world, if they are not able to find an agreement with the Palestinians, then the conflict will never end, and turmoil and violence will stay with us for a very long time. This is the danger, that a deal like this gives the impression that peace is possible in the region without reaching an agreement with the Palestinians. And of course, it is clearly, we clearly know that this is not possible when there are people under occupation that need a solution to their problem.
Well, I think you touched on a very important issue, the Palestinians themselves. Yes, maybe some Arab countries on the leadership level, on the political level might have, concessions and agreements with Israel. But when it comes to people on the ground, especially the Gaza and West Bank, so what are the positions of the leaderships over there? And whether this kind of agreement, and if that is followed by other Arab states, will how it will influence the leadership in these places, Gaza and West Bank?
Well, as I said, the reaction has been quite negative among the Palestinians, both at the official and at the popular level. Again, the Palestinians, together with all Arab states, signed on to the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002. The Arab Peace Initiative stated that if Israel withdraws from the occupied territories in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, from the Golan Heights, and from the Shaba farms in Lebanon, then all Arab states will sign a peace deal with Israel. The Palestinians are always accused of not putting solutions on the table. They have, in fact, put solutions on the table, whether through the Arab Peace Initiative or otherwise. I believe it is becoming clear, Professor Talib, that Israel does not intend to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, does not intend to withdraw from the occupied territories, does not intend to end the occupation and establish a two-state solution. And that puts the Palestinian in a particular bind. If they cannot have a two-state solution, if they cannot have a Palestinian state on Palestinian soil, then they cannot also remain under an apartheid system indefinitely. And they will have to start looking for alternatives. Alternatives like a one-state solution that was even taboo to talk about in the past. Today is not taboo because we are today in a one-state reality. It might not be a solution today, but there is a reality that Israel controls, the Palestinians over all the land that is occupied. It is an apartheid reality. And for it to become a solution, it needs to move from being an apartheid reality to a democratic solution. Right now, the international community and the Palestinians themselves want a solution based on two states.
Now, let me ask more specific question on the two-state solution. Now, some observers, actually many, said that this agreement between Israel and the UAE is a death blow to the two-state solution. Is that the case? I mean, now there is no more such, let's say, possibility. If there is no such possibility, what are the other alternatives that the, especially the Palestinian or the Arab side can offer?
Look, it is a bit stretching to say that the UAE-Israel deal in particular is the death blow. I mean, after all, again, I don't want to belittle any country, but the UAE, in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict, remains a very small country in the Arab world. It is not up to them to decide on the fate of the peace process. Having said that, I think Israel's unwillingness to discuss a credible two-state solution, Israel's willingness to annex parts of the West Bank, as well as the United Nations, as well as Trump's peace plan, what is called the deal of the century, these are the death blows to the peace process, to the two-state solution. If Israel annexes the land and if the Trump peace plan is implemented, there is no way that you can create a credible Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, because the plan calls for a state that is only on 60 to 70% of the West Bank, totally surrounded by Israel, in a Bandustan-like arrangement. That is the death to the two-state solution that we are looking at today.
Well, actually, you said that UAE is not a big part of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But why then this deal is presented in such a manner? I mean, as if at the core of this agreement, there is the issue of peace or the negotiation between
because you need to justify to the Arab world, you need to justify to the international community why you are signing such a deal, why you are breaking with the Arab Peace Initiative, why you are breaking with the consensus that is reached among all Arab states. And so it is easy to say that you are doing so in the interest and pursuit of peace. That's the easy and clear argument. But if you look at the facts, of course, the United Arab Emirates is not in a position to move the peace process forward or backward or sideways in any particular way. The United Arab Emirates and Israel have enjoyed close economic relations and security relations for a number of years. And for some reason, they chose to make that clear, make that public today. But I believe, and I think it is clear that the agreement has little to do with the peace process.
Okay, when you look at the agreement itself, then it is between the two countries, Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Which one is the beneficiary? I mean, which country benefits from this agreement more? Is it Israel or the United Arab Emirates? To me, it seems that Israel is the winner because Israel needs recognition in the Arab world. I think that opens a new chapter.
Well, I'll tell you why Israel, I think, is the bigger beneficiary. Because the Israelis have, for some time now, under Netanyahu, been saying, we don't need peace with the Palestinians. We have good relations with parts of the Arab world. The Arab world is ready to sign peace agreements with us before we solve the Palestinian issue. Therefore, we're going to bypass this issue. We don't need to pursue any serious effort to end the occupation and establish a Palestinian state, since we anyway can sign peace agreements with the Arab world. This is the danger that an agreement like this presents to the Palestinians and to the cause of peace itself. I can't emphasize enough that it is the Palestinians that are under occupation, not anybody else from the Arab world. And you, no matter what you do, you cannot escape this fact. Today you have close to 4 million Palestinians or more in the West Bank and Gaza. These are people that are not going to disappear just because you sign peace agreements with anybody else in the region.
Right. I think that is a very clear, I think, observation. This agreement is sometimes discussed within the context of regional developments, because especially in the tension is now increasing in the Eastern Mediterranean, and we see realignments and also intervention by several countries. In this context, I just would like to ask you what role countries that have already recognized Israel can play, like Turkey, Jordan, Egypt. These are three countries that have recognized, of course, the legitimate presence of Israel in the region. Do you think they can really make a difference in pressurizing Israel towards a peace deal?
I'm afraid not, if I want to be frank and blunt. Both Egypt and Jordan, when they signed agreements, believed that they can use their diplomatic ties with the Israeli state in order to push them towards peace with the Palestinians. But that has not materialized. And ever since the Likud-led government of Mr. Netanyahu came to power in 2009 and until now, for the last 11 years at least, Israel has clearly shown that regardless of its peace agreement with Israel, with Egypt, regardless of its peace agreement with Jordan, and regardless of its ties with Turkey, it is not going to budge in the direction of ending the Israeli occupation. And today you have a US administration which has supported Israel to the point where, you know, the Trump plan is a form of blind support for Israel controlling all of the land. So long as Israel has that support, there is little that any other country can do, including Turkey, Egypt, and Jordan, I'm afraid.
Well, anyway, Turkey has not very, I think, constructive relations with Israel in recent years.
Yes.
That's very clear. Of course, that's some kind of, you know, obstacle to put pressure on a country that you don't have a very close relationship. But what I meant by this, that, you know, these are three, you know, Muslim countries in the region, that they can maybe create some sort of environment, and also they can get some support from the let's say larger region. This is what I meant.
Yes, the international community, including these countries, has put forward a lot of plans in order to affect a two-state solution, if you want. The United Nations, you know, has Security Council resolutions supporting a Palestinian state. The Arabs came together with the Arab Peace Initiative. There have been many plans in the past. I'm afraid the time for a two-state solution is, in my view, over. You know, you have more than 700,000 settlers in the West Bank, almost 25% of the total population of the West Bank. It is very difficult demographically, if not impossible, to separate these people. No, of course, other than the fact that Israel is not interested in ending the occupation and in a separation. So the solution that is based on separation of the two communities, I think, is over. Today, even if the political will exists, and it doesn't, by the international community, the two-state solution is impossible to achieve. By insisting on a two-state solution by the international community, by keeping to say we are for a two-state solution without attaching a credible plan to affect that solution, the international community is actually contributing to the death of the two-state solution. Because if they cannot affect a credible plan, all they are doing is giving Israel time that Israel is using to annex more of the land and to really render a two-state solution impossible. So,
do you see the Arab Peace Initiative in the same context, in the same direction? I mean, it is also dead. It doesn't produce anything new.
The time when the Arab Peace Initiative was passed, and I was I was foreign minister then, one of the people who contributed to the development of the Arab Peace Initiative. The time is past. The Arab world is in a different condition today than it was before. King Abdullah then of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Abdullah then of Saudi Arabia, had the stature to bring about all the Arab states around him and to have consensus on this. Today, every Arab state is concerned with its domestic challenges, whether it is Egypt or Syria or Iraq. Today, the Arab Peace Initiative also is no more than lip service to the two-state solution. If Israel and Israel has not given up any serious attention, it is difficult to see how the Arab Peace Initiative today can be implemented. I'm afraid, Talib, I'm afraid that we are today, as I said, looking at a situation where the focus of the conflict is moving from the shape of a solution to a rights-based approach. In other words, Palestinians are going to say, if we cannot have our own state on Palestinian soil, then we are not going to accept an apartheid system indefinitely. We are going to call for equal rights, political as well as civic rights, in the territories that we are living in. That is what the international community is going to have to face, if not today, then in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, because we already today have a Palestinian majority in areas under Israel's control.
Right. Maybe you can, specific to talk about Gaza and West Bank. But in this picture, we don't see, people who had to leave Palestine. Now, there are, millions of Palestinians outside the country. And when we talk about peace plan or the peace initiative, we are not only concentrating on people who are living in the Israeli territories, either occupied or in the mainland Israel, but also we are talking about people who have right to return. I mean, so what will happen to them? I mean,
the separation argument, the two-state solution, doesn't take care of these people, doesn't take care of the Palestinian diaspora. It only takes care of the Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Palestinians today, including those in the diaspora, but also those inside Israel, are calling for a new paradigm based on equal rights. When you talk about equal rights, then you're talking about everybody, including in the diaspora, enjoying sort of a status of being part of their ancestral home, even if they don't go back and live there. I mean, it is clear that you have over 5 or 6 million Palestinians in the diaspora. It is clear that there's no way that these people can all go back. So we are not talking about a physical return. We are talking about a right of return that is not necessarily physical, but one that acknowledges the rights of everybody living or on that land, including the Palestinians in the diaspora whose ancestors have lived on that land for thousands of years.
Mr. Muashir, the Arab League and the Arab world in the 1980s and also in the 1990s, I think were, united in a better way. Today, you said the Arab world has changed. It is not the same, I think, region. It is not the same nation states. There is a different mode. There are, Arab Springs that have happened and things have changed. The Arab-Israeli conflict, or the occupation of Palestinian land by Israel, was at the top priority of the Arab states. It seems today that this is not the case. Why? And do you think there is, in the near future, such a emergence of this issue on the Arab agenda?
Look, it is true that the Arab world today is preoccupied with its own domestic challenges. It is true that Arab leaders today are not sort of in firm control of their countries like they used to be before. And it is true that the region has suffered from authoritarian rule for a long time, and each leader and each country is preoccupied with their own position and staying in power in these countries. That does not mean that the Arab world has forgot about Palestine. That does not mean that the Arab public does not regard the Palestinian issue as central to its identity.
Well, actually, I differentiate between the leadership and the
Absolutely.
public.
No, and it's important to make that distinction, because if you look at the polls throughout the Arab world, it is clear that the Palestinian issue remains at the center of the radar screen of almost every Arab population in every Arab country. Israel tries to depict that the Palestinian issue is no longer important to the Arab population. One, that is not true, as I said. Two, whether it is true or not does not negate the fact that the Palestinians are living amongst, the territories that Israel controlled, and that whether the rest of the Arab population cares about this issue or not, you are not going to escape the fact that you are going to have 4 to 5 million Palestinians other than the Palestinians inside Israel that are going to soon start demanding equal rights. And so that is the problem that Israel has to face, not the problem with its outer environment, not the problem with the rest of the Arab world. Because even if it signs a peace agreement with every single Arab state, other than the Palestinians, they will still have to come to terms with how to deal with 5 million Palestinians demanding equal rights.
When the Arab world or some of the countries, when they have rapprochement with Israel, the main reason, as you have just indicated, is security, the threat by Iran. How does that agreement, let's say, empower Iran to claim the ownership of this Palestinian issue?
Iran has had, strong ties with some Palestinian factions, including Hamas, who, by the way, is Sunni-based. It's not. Iran has had these ties in the past, but again, regardless of these strong ties, Iran is not in a position to determine the fate of the Palestinian-Israeli issue. The Hamas issue today is not militarily an important issue. Today, the issue, I claim, is demographic. In addition to it being political, today you will not be able to ignore a majority of Palestinians in territories under your control if you are Israel. That is going to be the danger and the danger to Israelis in the future if they continue to refuse a two-state solution.
Right. The international community, as you have said, also failed to move this issue forward in many instances, and also international organizations. There is always a criticism of UN and also EU. Do you think they might have any role in bringing this issue to the, UN agenda or EU agenda, so that there might be some kind of push towards a peace?
Again, I was part of this effort by the international community. I dealt with the EU and with the United States a lot. The EU, while it has taken positions supporting international law against the acquisition of territory by force and all that, the EU has never took an independent position vis-a-vis the United States. It has always allowed the United States to be at the front of these efforts and has always sort of was a step or two behind. With the United States, again, there were efforts like the quartet, if you remember, with the United States, the EU, Russia, and the United Nations, that have also tried to push the peace process forward. There were UN resolutions that supported the establishment of a Palestinian state, that called for Israel to withdraw from occupied territory, etc. None of these resolutions were passed under Chapter 7, none of them. Which has, Chapter 7 is the chapter that allows the UN to exercise force, if necessary, to implement their decisions in the same way that they did with Iraq, for example. And so the United Nations today is not in a position to affect a peace agreement if there is no enforcing mechanism for that agreement Today, with the United States calling for Israel, supporting Israel's move to annex the land, and with Israel clearly acting in a way that prevents the establishment of a two-state solution, Israel does not see anyone in this world able to stop it, not the EU and not the United Nations, unfortunately.
Mr. Muashir, in your observations, you have pointed out that there is a gap between the Arab leaders and the streets, the Arab people in general. And I think we have seen this during the Arab revolutions, how the difference was there, the gap. It seems that I think this gap is still there, as you said. The feelings of the Arab street towards the Palestinian issue is different than the leadership who have closer links with Israel. Do you think that feelings will be mobilized by the Arab streets because there is such kind of frustration, and also COVID-19 also puts pressure on the economy and expectations? How that will play out in the near future?
It's difficult to tell how it will play out. The Arab street also today is facing huge economic problems because of COVID-19, because of the decline of oil prices. Today, the Arab world, the oil era in the Arab world is drawing to a close. Today, the welfare state model, if you will, that has been put forward by oil is today on a retreat. So the Arab world is facing its own domestic issues. Lack of good governance is a very important issue. So I cannot tell you whether Arabs will go to the street regarding one particular development. But if it becomes clear, in my view, that Israel will annex the land and will declare Jerusalem, out of negotiations, etc., then that's not going to sit well with the Arab street, and I don't think the Arab street will remain quiet about it.
Well, Mr. Marwan Muashir, former Deputy Prime Minister of Jordan, thank you very much for joining at the TRT World Forum Digital Debates. It was a great pleasure to have you here as a host. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Truly appreciate it.
And now we come to the end of this session on the impact of the Israeli and UAE agreement on the Palestinian issue, on the regional developments. And it's the end of our debate today. Thank you very much for following us. See you next time. Goodbye.